Two cops thought they could crush anyone under the weight of their badge, but their fatal mistake was shooting Ace, the loyal dog of a black man they thought was powerless. What they didn't know, the man they cuffed and beat was Darius Cole, a former Delta Force commander, a ghost from the battlefield. And from that moment, a town would tremble under his wrath until justice was delivered in a trial no one would ever forget. The courtroom was packed so tightly it felt like the air itself had turned heavy. Rows of wooden benches groaned under the weight of bodies leaning forward, every eye fixed on the scene unfolding at the front. Reporters had filled the gallery, their pens scratching, cameras clicking, while members of the community, old women clutching purses, fathers with folded arms, young men standing rigid in the back, watched with the kind of intensity that came only when something larger than a trial was happening. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, throwing a pale glare over the defendants. Two white officers seated at the defense table, their wrists cuffed, their shoulders hunched as if even the suits they wore couldn't disguise the fact that they were already condemned in the eyes of the public. Gregory Doyle sat stiff, his jaw clenched, his once proud posture bent under the weight of humiliation. Next to him, Trent Fisher shifted uncomfortably, a swollen lip still visible, his eyes darting like a man trapped in a cage. Both of them looked small now, stripped of the arrogance that once hung on them like armor. Behind them, the seal of the state loomed large on the wall, a reminder of an authority they had abused until it finally collapsed around them. And then there was the man at the center of it all. Darius Cole sat across the aisle, not at the defense table, not in chains, but upright and composed in a dark suit that fit his frame with quiet precision. His presence filled the room without a single word. The scars of years spent in deserts and jungles weren't visible to the jury, but they clung to him in the set of his shoulders, the steady calm of his breath, the unflinching steel in his eyes. He didn't fidget, didn't shift in his seat. He simply stared ahead, his hands folded loosely in his lap, a soldier who had faced warlords and insurgents and now faced something far colder, the justice system deciding whether the men who killed his dog would finally be held to account. The judge entered, robes sweeping, gavel striking once with a sharp crack that cut through the murmurs. "Court is now in session," he announced, his voice stern but weary, the kind of tone that belonged to a man who had seen too many trials, too many excuses. He looked down at Doyle and Trent with an expression that carried no sympathy. "All rise," the bailiff had said moments earlier, and everyone had obeyed. But when they sat back down, it was clear that no one intended to relax. Every breath, every cough, every scrape of a shoe seemed magnified. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman with her hair tied back in a no-nonsense bun, rose first. She carried a stack of files but hardly looked at them, her gaze sweeping across the jury before she began. "Ladies and gentlemen, you will hear many things today," she said, her voice firm but measured. "But do not forget the truth that binds this case together. These two officers," she pointed toward Doyle and Trent, who sat rigid, "shot and killed a man's loyal companion. They harassed him, humiliated him, and thought they would walk away untouched, as they always had before. But this time, they chose the wrong man." The jury's eyes flicked toward Darius. Some of them had heard rumors already, whispers about his past, about what kind of soldier he had been. The words Delta Force had made their rounds through the community like a storm. But no one could quite reconcile the calm figure sitting there with the specter of violence they imagined. That contrast, that quiet dignity, carried more power than 100 shouted words. Doyle leaned over and muttered something under his breath to his attorney. The lawyer gave a quick shake of his head, whispering for him to keep quiet. Trent rubbed at his wrists, eyes low, as though he knew the cameras were catching every nervous twitch. From the gallery came a cough, then a hushed voice. "That's him. That's the man they tried to break." Others murmured in agreement, their voices swelling into a low tide before the bailiff barked, "Quiet!" Darius didn't turn. He kept his gaze fixed forward, his mind no doubt elsewhere. Perhaps it was on the sound of the waves that night, the feel of Ace's weight against his leg as they walked, the sudden crack of a gunshot tearing that piece apart. Or maybe it was on the promise he had made when Ace's body went limp in his arms, that he would not let the men responsible disappear into the shadows like so many others had. The judge's voice broke the silence again. "We will begin with opening statements. Mr. Hayes?" He nodded to the prosecutor. "Yes, Your Honor." As the prosecutor began to lay out the story, each sentence sharper than the last, the room seemed to contract, drawing tighter around Darius. The officers who once believed themselves untouchable now looked like small men drowning in the enormity of their crimes. The jury leaned forward, captivated. And still, Darius sat unmoving, his silence louder than any speech. He didn't need to shout his pain. He didn't need to beg for justice. His very presence was the reminder. He had faced enemies on foreign soil, survived missions whispered about in secret corridors of power, and yet nothing had cut him deeper than what happened that night on a quiet beach in his own country. The prosecutor's voice rose, echoing through the chamber. This trial is not only about the death of a dog, it is about abuse of power. It is about men who believed a badge made them gods. It is about what happens when fear and prejudice go unchecked. But most of all, it is about accountability. And today, for the first time in their lives, these men will face it. All eyes turned once more toward Darius. He exhaled slowly, shoulders steady, the faintest flicker of memory passing through his mind. Ace's eyes, wide and loyal, looking at him in those final moments. The sound of his sister Amara's voice insisting he let the system work. The quiet certainty in Elias's words. "Justice doesn't come from them, son. It comes from you." The gavel struck again. The trial had begun, and though no one in the room could see it yet, the story they were about to hear would unravel everything Doyle and Trent thought they knew about power, about control, and about fear. Because they hadn't just killed a dog. They had awakened the ghost of Delta Force, and now there was no going back. The late afternoon light poured across the harbor town like honey, spilling over rooftops and painting the weathered wood of fishing boats in gold. The gulls cried overhead, their sharp voices carried by the salty breeze rolling in from the ocean. On the far edge of the pier, away from the bustle of fishermen hauling nets and tourists licking ice cream cones, a stretch of sand opened wide and quiet, the kind of place that felt like it belonged to no one and everyone at the same time. It was here that Darius Cole chose to walk, the leash loose in his hand, the dark figure of Ace trotting faithfully at his side. Ace's paws pressed into the damp sand, leaving prints that the tide reached for but never quite caught. His ears flicked with every sound, alert but untroubled. He was a Doberman with sleek black fur that glistened against the setting sun, muscles shifting like taut cables under his skin. But his eyes, those eyes, were soft whenever they turned toward Darius. Loyal, trusting, the kind of look that made the world feel just a little less cruel. Darius breathed deeply, pulling in the briny air, letting it wash through him. This was the part of the day he cherished, the narrow window where silence existed between what had been and what was coming. For so many years, his evenings had been filled with the hum of distant gunfire, the crackle of radios, the endless drone of helicopters cutting across foreign skies. Now, all he had was the rhythm of the waves and the steady sound of Ace's breath. It should have been enough, but he couldn't shake the habit of watching. Even as he moved along the shoreline, his eyes swept the horizon, his senses tuned to the smallest shifts, the fisherman who paused a little too long, the car parked above the bluff with its engine idling, the couple who turned away as soon as he looked their direction. He didn't know if it was instinct or paranoia anymore. All he knew was that the world had taught him too many times. Peace was fragile. Ace stopped suddenly, head lifting, ears pointed toward the dunes. Darius slowed, following his gaze. Nothing moved, only the tall seagrass swaying with the wind. Still, he tightened his grip on the leash, murmuring low, "Easy, boy." Ace's tail swished once before he leaned back into stride, obedient as ever. Darius let out a breath, but the unease lingered like smoke. He thought of his sister Amara then, the way she used to scold him for his vigilance. "You're not on mission anymore, D," she'd tell him with that lawyer's firmness she wore like armor. "This town isn't Fallujah. You can breathe here." He'd smile, maybe even laugh, but the truth was he didn't know how to let go. The war had ended for everyone else, not for him. A boy tossed a frisbee further down the beach, his laughter sharp and innocent. Ace's ears perked, body tensing with the urge to chase, But one word from Darius, "Stay," and the dog settled, disciplined to his core. Darius crouched, running a hand along the ridge of Ace's back, feeling the warmth beneath the coat, the pulse of life strong and steady. He whispered, almost to himself, "You're the only thing that makes this place feel like home." Ace leaned into him, pressing his weight against Darius's leg, as if answering without words. The sun dipped lower, burning orange across the water. Shadows stretched long and thin, turning the sand into ribbons of light and dark. Darius closed his eyes for a moment, letting himself believe in the quiet. Maybe, just maybe, he thought, this could last. But when he opened them, he saw the reflection of headlights cresting the ridge above the beach. A vehicle rolled slowly along the road, too slow to be casual, too deliberate to be aimless. Darius felt the shift immediately, the way the air changed, the way Ace stiffened. He didn't move, not yet. He simply stood there, the leash held steady, watching the car crawl along until it disappeared beyond the curve. Ace whined softly, as if asking whether to be concerned. Darius knelt again, his voice calm but edged with something he couldn't hide. "Not yet, buddy. Not yet." He rubbed the dog's neck, burying his fingers in the thick fur, grounding himself in the simple comfort of that touch. A wave crashed harder than the others, spraying mist across his boots. He straightened, scanning the shoreline once more. People still moved about, the boy with the frisbee, a couple collecting shells, the jogger in bright sneakers pounding a path along the wet sand. Normal life, nothing extraordinary. Yet Darius couldn't shake the certainty pressing against his chest. Someone had been watching. He turned back toward the pier, guiding Ace with him. The leash hung loose, but his mind was taut, strung tight with the same readiness that had kept him alive on battlefields across the globe. The world around him might have been painted in gold by the setting sun, but beneath that glow, he sensed the truth. Peace never lasted. And somewhere, hidden in the lengthening shadows of this small coastal town, trouble was already moving toward him. The last of the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving streaks of red and violet smeared across the sky when Darius noticed the cruiser roll down from the bluff above. Its headlights flickered once before settling into a slow crawl along the edge of the beach. He stopped walking, his boots sinking lightly into the sand, Ace halting beside him with the same stillness. The dog's ears pricked, body tense, a low vibration beginning deep in his chest. Darius reached down, a steady hand brushing over the taut line of his back. "Easy, boy," he murmured, though his own pulse had begun to climb. The cruiser drew closer until the words "police" shone clearly against the fading light. It stopped with a deliberate grind of tires, and two figures emerged, shapes framed in authority they wielded like a weapon. Sergeant Doyle leaned against the hood, his frame broad and posture casual, but his eyes glinted with calculation. Next to him, Officer Trent adjusted his belt with restless energy, his jaw tight, a man itching for an excuse. "Evening," Doyle called out, voice heavy with the weight of assumption rather than courtesy. Darius turned slowly, his expression calm, measured, the leash still held steady in his hand. "Evening, officers," he answered, the words polite but neutral, carrying none of the deference they expected. Trent stepped forward, boots sinking into the sand with a crunch. "You live around here?" he asked, his tone clipped. Darius met his gaze without flinching. "Yes." Doyle cocked his head, a half smile curling on his lips. "Funny, don't think I've seen you before." "I just got back," Darius replied. His voice was level, as though he were commenting on the weather. "Been away for work." "What kind of work?" Trent pressed, his eyes flicking down to Ace, whose body now stood rigid, watching every move. "Security," Darius said. "Overseas." Trent snorted. "Sounds like a fancy way of saying mercenary." Darius gave the smallest shrug, no offense taken, though he felt the familiar edge of irritation prick at him. "Not quite. Private security, risk assessment, training, that sort of thing." Doyle pushed off the hood, walking closer now, his boots leaving sharp imprints in the sand. "We got a call about someone suspicious walking around the neighborhood," he said smoothly, as if rehearsed. "Figured we should check it out." Darius raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious? For walking my dog?" "Depends on the dog," Trent muttered, his eyes narrowing on Ace. The Doberman hadn't moved, but his growl deepened, barely audible, vibrating like a warning. "He's trained," Darius said firmly. "Trained for what?" Doyle asked, his smirk widening, as if each question were a hook meant to drag Darius into anger. Obedience, protection, Darius replied, his voice steady. Trent tilted his head, stepping even closer, enough that Ace shifted his stance, body angled between his master and the officers. That's a big dog, Trent said, feigning casual interest though his hand had already strayed near his holster. Looks dangerous to me. He's under control, Darius said sharply, a trace of steel edging into his voice. Doyle gave a slow nod, pretending to consider it, then said, Gonna need to see some ID. Darius knew the game. He could argue, recite his rights, stand his ground. But he also knew the glint in Doyle's eye, the restless twitch in Trent's fingers. They weren't here to verify who he was. They were here to break him. Still, he moved carefully, slowly reaching into his jacket. Ace rumbled, taking a half step forward. Whoa, whoa! Trent barked, hand jerking toward his gun. Control your animal. Darius's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level. He is controlled. Doesn't look like it, Doyle sneered. Darius pulled out his wallet, extending it with deliberate calm. Here. Trent snatched it with unnecessary roughness, flipping it open. His smirk faltered for a split second when he saw the details, but quickly returned. Darius Cole, he read aloud, as though the name itself were an offense. He tossed the wallet back. Military background, huh? Doyle leaned closer, voice laced with disdain. Delta Force? That's supposed to impress me? Darius caught the wallet, tucking it back into his pocket, never breaking eye contact. No, just facts. Doyle's smirk deepened. Well, fact is, folks around here get nervous when they see someone who doesn't belong. I do belong, Darius said quietly, his voice carrying weight. I live here. Trent scoffed. Got an attitude on him, don't he? Yeah, Doyle agreed, almost like he's got something to hide. The leash tightened slightly in Darius's grip as Ace picked up on the shift, his entire body poised, waiting. Darius could feel it too, the invisible line tightening the moment before a storm breaks. He breathed out slow, steady, forcing his body into stillness. Turn around, Doyle said suddenly, his tone sharp, authoritative. Hands behind your back. Just for our safety. Darius didn't move. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the edge beneath it. I haven't done anything. That right? Doyle sneered, stepping closer, his hand twitching near his gun. Then you won't mind. Trent reached out, his fingers brushing against Darius's wrist. In that instant, Ace snapped. A snarl ripped through the air, sharp as a blade, the dog lunging forward a fraction, teeth bared. Get that damn dog back, Trent shouted, stumbling, hand flying to his weapon. He is under control, Darius barked, snapping the command. Ace froze, muscles coiled, his eyes blazing but his body locked by training. But the officers weren't listening. They didn't see control, didn't see restraint. They saw what they wanted to see, threat. And in that twisted moment, as the tide hissed against the shore and the gulls screamed overhead, Darius realized the decision had already been made in their eyes. Trent's gun cleared leather, the barrel rising. The crack of the shot split the evening in two. Ace's body jerked, a flash of red against the sand, and the world, for Darius Cole, shattered. The sound of the gunshot still hung in the air when Ace stumbled, his body twisting mid-lunge, a choked whimper breaking from his throat. Darius felt the leash rip through his palm as the weight of the dog dropped suddenly, violently, to the sand. For a moment, the world slowed. He could hear the ocean crash against the shore, could smell the salt and the faint tang of blood already spilling into the grit beneath them. The horizon blurred as his vision tunneled down to the one thing that mattered, the dark, sleek body of the only companion he trusted lying broken at his feet. He dropped to his knees, scooping Ace into his arms, the heat of his dog's blood seeping instantly into his clothes, staining his hands. No, 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 he muttered, voice raw, the words breaking apart as they tumbled out. Ace's chest heaved, shallow and ragged, his eyes wide and desperate, searching Darius's face for direction, for reassurance, for the command that would make this stop. Darius pressed his hand over the wound, feeling the warmth slipping between his fingers. Stay with me, buddy. Stay with me. You're okay. You're okay. Behind him, Trent still held the smoking gun, his arms stiff, his face twisted into something halfway between triumph and fear. Doyle hovered a few feet away, expression unreadable, but his lips curling into the kind of smirk that made Darius's stomach turn cold. Told you he was a liability, Doyle muttered almost casually, as though Ace's death were inevitable from the moment they stepped onto the sand. Darius looked up at them, eyes blazing, his chest heaving as if every breath was fire. He wanted to stand, to close the distance between them and tear them apart with his bare hands. But Ace whimpered, the sound small and sharp, pulling him back down. He tightened his grip, lowering his forehead against the dog's, whispering hoarse promises only Ace could hear. "I've got you, boy. Just breathe. Just hold on. Hands where we can see 'em," Trent shouted, snapping out of his own shock, his weapon raised now, both hands gripping it tight. "Get your hands up now." Darius's jaw locked, fury boiling under his skin, but his hands refused to leave Ace. He could feel the pulse fading beneath his palm, could feel the life slipping faster than he could stop it. He raised his head, his voice carrying a deadly calm that belied the storm raging inside. "He's dying, and you did this. Get your hands up," Doyle barked, stepping forward now, his tone edged with authority he no longer deserved. Darius exhaled hard, forcing control where there was none left. Slowly, he lifted one hand into the air, fingers slick with Ace's blood, while the other stayed pressed against the wound. Ace's chest rattled, his breath shallow, each one weaker than the last. The officers closed in, boots crunching against the sand. Trent's gun never wavered, his eyes jittering with the kind of fear that made men dangerous. Doyle moved with more swagger, less caution, like he believed the badge on his chest still made him invincible. He grabbed at Darius's arm, jerking him back. "On your feet. Now." Darius staggered up, refusing to let go of Ace until Doyle wrenched him away, shoving him hard enough that his knees buckled against the shifting ground. Ace fell back onto the sand, his body twitching once, then settling into a stillness that punched the air from Darius's lungs. He lunged forward instinctively, but Trent jammed the muzzle of his gun into his ribs, shoving him back upright. "Don't move," Trent hissed, though his voice cracked, betraying the rush of adrenaline, the shaky edge of someone who knew he'd just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Darius's fists curled, blood, his dog's blood, drying between his fingers. Every instinct screamed at him to fight, to disarm Trent, to drive Doyle's smug grin into the sand until there was nothing left. But discipline, drilled into him through years of combat, locked his muscles in place. He knew what would happen if he so much as twitched. Another shot, another loss. And this time it would be him. "Put your hands behind your back," Doyle ordered, pulling out the cuffs with a flick of his wrist. "I haven't done anything," Darius said, voice low but steady, each word vibrating with restrained rage. "You resisted," Doyle snapped. "Your dog attacked. You're under arrest." "He never moved until you pulled the trigger," Darius shot back, but he didn't resist as Doyle yanked his arms behind him, the cold metal biting into his wrists. From somewhere above the dunes came the faint flicker of a curtain pulling back, the hush of a neighbor retreating from their window. Darius knew what that meant. They'd watched, but they wouldn't intervene. Fear had silenced them long before tonight. Doyle leaned close as he clicked the cuffs tighter, his breath hot against Darius's ear. "Keep your mouth shut, soldier. Nobody's going to believe you anyway." The words slid into Darius's chest like a blade. He clenched his jaw, eyes locked on Ace, lying motionless in the sand. The dog's body was still, the tide inching closer, licking at the edges of the dark stain beneath him. Darius felt something in him tear, a seam ripping wide, but he buried it deep, where the officers couldn't reach. They shoved him forward, marching him across the beach, each step heavier than the last. His mind wasn't on the cold steel cutting into his wrists or the gun still pressed against his side. It was on the promise that had already formed like iron in his chest. They had taken everything from him in that moment, but he would not let it stand. As they hauled him toward the cruiser, Darius turned his head once, one last time, his eyes lingering on Ace's body against the sand. The wind lifted, carrying the scent of salt and gunpowder, and he whispered under his breath, words only the ocean could hear. "I'll make this right." Then the door of the cruiser slammed, and the world went dark. The cell was colder than it had any right to be, the concrete walls sweating with damp that clung to the skin. Darius sat on the hard bench, wrists raw from the cuffs that had been yanked off and tossed onto a desk before he was shoved inside. The smell was sharp, a mix of bleach, iron bars, and the faint stench of old sweat. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at his hands. They were still stained dark, dried streaks of Ace's blood etched into the lines of his palms. He rubbed them together once, as though friction might erase the memory, but nothing could scrub it away. The door at the end of the row clanged shut, heavy footsteps echoing down the corridor. He barely lifted his head until the guard slid another man into the cell across from his. The older man moved slowly, his body heavy with years, but his eyes, sharp, knowing, scanned the room before settling on Darius. His hair was mostly gone, his beard streaked with gray. He carried himself like someone used to being listened to, even in shackles. The guard shoved him forward with a muttered curse, then walked away, leaving silence in his wake. The old man lowered himself onto the bench opposite, his breathing even, steady. For a long moment, the two sat in silence, only the distant hum of fluorescent lights filling the space between them. "You've got the look," the old man finally said, his voice low and gravelly, shaped by years of sermons or speeches. Darius didn't move. "What look is that?" "The kind a man wears when he's lost something that can't be replaced." Darius lifted his gaze, the fury simmering behind his eyes, visible even in the dim light. "My dog! They killed him, shot him in front of me." The old man nodded slowly, as though the confession had confirmed something he already knew. "Name's Elias," he said. "Used to be a preacher, spent the last few years making noise about police brutality, housing rights, the kind of things nobody in power likes to hear. That's how I ended up here. Guess they figured I should cool off." Darius leaned back, jaw tight. "They'll keep me here too. Long enough for it all to disappear, long enough for them to write their own story." Elias studied him for a moment, then leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You military?" Darius's eyes flickered but didn't look away. "Delta Force, Commander." A slow whistle slipped from Elias's lips. "Well, hell, that explains the eyes." "What eyes?" "The ones that don't blink, son. The ones that have seen too much and don't scare easy anymore." Elias tapped his chest with two fingers. "But I'll tell you something. Men like us, we're dangerous to a system that survives on fear. They know they can't break you the usual way, so they'll bury you instead. Paperwork, lies, silence. They'll smother the truth until it's gone." Darius clenched his fists. "They already started. They called Ace a threat. Said he came at them. He didn't. He was trained better than any of them ever will be. He was under control, but that didn't matter. They wanted an excuse." Elias nodded, his face grim. "It never matters. You could do everything right, stay calm, follow the rules, and they'll still paint you as the villain. You're black, and you scare them. That's all the reason they need." The words cut deep, not because they were new, but because they were true. Darius leaned back against the wall, the cold biting through his shirt. He thought of Amara, his sister, the way she'd fight tooth and nail through the courts if she knew what had happened. She'd believe in the system because she had to. That was her weapon. But him, he'd lived long enough to know better. "You sound like you've already decided how this ends," Elias said after a moment. Darius looked down at his hands again, the dried blood like a brand. "I've been in places where justice didn't exist, where the strong took what they wanted and no one stopped them. I fought those men. I buried them. And now I come home and I see the same thing, just wearing a badge." He lifted his eyes, steady now, cold. "I know exactly how this ends." Elias's gaze sharpened. "Don't let anger eat you alive, son. That's what they count on. A man full of rage makes mistakes, and mistakes will get you buried faster than any bullet." "This isn't just anger," Darius said quietly, almost to himself. "It's purpose." The silence stretched, the hum of the lights filling the air again. Elias leaned back, shaking his head. "You remind me of myself 30 years ago. Thought I could burn down the world to build a better one. But fire don't care what it touches. It'll eat everything if you let it." Darius stood, pacing once, the confines of the cell too small to contain the energy running through him. He could still feel Ace's body go limp in his arms, still hear that last broken whimper. He clenched his fist so hard his knuckles popped. Elias watched him carefully, then spoke softer. "You want justice. You'll need more than strength. You'll need patience, precision. You'll need to make sure when you strike, it leaves a mark they can't erase." Darius stopped at the bars, staring down the empty corridor. "I've been trained for patience. I've been trained for precision. They taught me how to wait, how to plan, how to hit so hard a man never gets back up. They thought they broke me when they killed him. All they did was remind me who I am." Elias sighed, closing his eyes for a moment as though in prayer. "Then God help us all." Footsteps echoed again, this time heavier, the jangling of keys growing louder until a guard appeared. "Cole?" The man barked, rattling the bars. "Your lawyer's here. On your feet." Darius straightened, his face settling back into that calm, impenetrable mask. He glanced once more at Elias. The old man's eyes were still sharp, though wearied, as if he'd seen too many men walk this path. "Remember what I said," Elias murmured. "Patience, precision. Don't let the fire blind you." Darius gave a slight nod, then stepped forward as the door screeched open. The guard grabbed his arm, yanking him into the hallway. As the cell door slammed shut behind him, Elias's voice drifted out, low and steady. "Justice doesn't come from them, son. It comes from you." The words lingered as Darius was led down the corridor, the echo of steel doors clanging shut behind him, every sound hammering the promise deeper into his chest. He didn't know yet what shape it would take, but he knew one thing with certainty. Doyle and Trent had started something they couldn't control. And Darius Cole wasn't the kind of man who let things go unfinished. The police station had that same sour smell that clung to most places built on authority and neglect, burnt coffee, sweat, and the faint sting of cleaning chemicals that never seemed to mask the deeper rot. Darius sat alone in a small interview room, his wrists still red from the cuffs, his body steady though his mind seethed. The fluorescent light above buzzed intermittently, flickering in a way that reminded him of tents lit by generators overseas, places where silence never meant safety. He could hear voices in the hall, low murmurs, the scrape of shoes, the creak of doors. He knew they weren't discussing charges. They were discussing him. Through the small window in the door, two uniformed officers glanced in, their faces etched with curiosity, maybe even unease. One whispered to the other before they both shook their heads and moved away. Darius stayed still, his hands folded loosely on the table. He wasn't giving them the satisfaction of nerves. He'd learned long ago that fear was an invitation for men like Doyle and Trent. The door opened, and a plainclothes officer walked in, a thick manila file in his hand. His tie was loosened, his shirt sleeves rolled up, like he wanted to play the role of someone approachable. But his eyes betrayed it, cold, assessing, like a man poking at a snake behind glass. He dropped the file onto the table and sat down across from Darius, leaning back in his chair. "Cole, isn't it?" the officer said, flipping the file open. He pretended to skim, but it was clear he'd already read every line. Darius Cole, 43, born in Georgia, served 15 years in the Army, Special Operations, Delta Force. He looked up, eyebrows raised. Hell of a resume, commander no less. Darius said nothing, his jaw locked, his eyes fixed steady on the man. The officer chuckled softly. "You know, most guys who sit where you're sitting, they're nobodies. Petty thieves, junkies, drunk drivers. But you're different. You're the kind of man people whisper about, the kind of man who's been places he can't talk about." He tapped the file with his finger. "They got your whole service record in here, or at least the parts that aren't blacked out." Darius shifted slightly, leaning back in his chair, arms folding across his chest. "So you've been reading bedtime stories?" The officer smirked. "I'm just wondering what a man like you is doing getting into trouble over a dog." The word hit hard, sharp, but Darius didn't flinch. "His name was Ace," he said flatly. The officer raised his hands in mock surrender. "All right, Ace. Still, you gotta admit, this doesn't look good. Two decorated officers say your animal came at them. You resisted arrest? You've got a temper, Cole? You snap easy?" Darius's voice was calm, deliberate. "I didn't resist, and my dog was trained better than either of them will ever be. He didn't attack. He reacted to them putting their hands on me." "Maybe," the officer said, leaning forward now. "But let me tell you how this works. Those two have badges. They file a report. That's the story. Folks up the chain don't dig too deep when it comes to their own. You're just another angry black man with a record that makes people nervous." He tapped the file again, this time harder. "Delta Force Commander, Ruthless, trained killer. That's what they'll say. Doesn't matter what else is in here." Darius's eyes narrowed, his breath steady though rage burned in his chest. "They should be nervous." The officer paused, then gave a dry laugh. "See? That right there, that's what I mean. You don't even have to raise your voice to scare the hell out of people. He closed the file, sliding it aside. Truth is, Cole, they don't know what to do with you. Men like Doyle and Trent, they usually walk away clean. But with you, they're rattled. They know what you are. They know they poked a man who's been through hell and walked out the other side. That scares them more than anything. The door opened again, and Doyle himself stepped in. His uniform shirt crisp, but his smirk even sharper than before. "Having a nice chat?" he asked, glancing between the officer and Darius. The plainclothes man sighed, pushing up from the chair. "Just getting acquainted." He patted the file as he left. "Be careful with this one. He's not like the others." When the door shut, Doyle circled the table, his boots heavy against the linoleum. He leaned close, planting his hands on the metal surface, his face inches from Darius's. "You think you're untouchable because of who you used to be? Out there, maybe. But here, you're just another suspect." Darius met his stare, unblinking. "Out there, I dealt with men who thought the same. None of them walked away." For the first time, Doyle's smirk faltered. It lasted only a second, but Darius saw it. Saw the flicker of doubt, the recognition that beneath the calm exterior sat a man forged by years of violence no badge could shield against. Doyle straightened, masking it with a scoff. "Enjoy yourself, soldier. Don't get too comfortable." He turned, rapping his knuckles against the door until it opened, then walked out without another word. Alone again, Darius let out a slow breath, steadying himself. They had dug into his past, tried to use it as a weapon, but they didn't understand. They thought his history made him dangerous. What they didn't realize was that it made him disciplined. He had learned to wait, to plan, to strike only when the time was right. He looked down at his hands, at the faint traces of Ace's blood that still clung to his skin. Doyle and Trent thought they had seen the worst of him tonight. They were wrong. They hadn't seen anything yet. The station air still clung to him when the heavy door creaked open, and Darius stepped out into the night, escorted by a guard who looked more annoyed than concerned. His wrists were red from the cuffs, but he held his head high, his face an impenetrable mask. The sky was black now, the kind of darkness only a small coastal town could hold, where the ocean swallowed the last traces of daylight and left only the sound of waves crashing against rock. He didn't stop moving until he saw her waiting by the curb. Amara Cole stood with her arms crossed, her tailored blazer pulled tight against the cold wind. The streetlight cast a pale glow over her, highlighting the sharp line of her jaw, the anger blazing in her eyes. She was younger by 6 years, but carried herself with a confidence that could silence rooms full of men twice her age. When she saw Darius, her shoulders stiffened, her expression breaking just slightly with relief before she strode forward. "Jesus D," she said, her voice low but shaking with fury. "What the hell did they do to you?" "I'm fine," he answered, though the words came out heavier than he meant. Her eyes dropped to his wrists, to the raw skin, then flicked back up, her voice sharper now. "Fine, they had you in a cell. They called me, tried to spin some garbage story about resisting arrest. And Ace." Her voice caught, the name too heavy, too painful to push through. She swallowed hard, blinking rapidly before steadying herself again. "They killed him, didn't they?" Darius didn't answer with words. He didn't have to. The silence, the shadow in his eyes, was enough. Amara looked away, jaw clenched, the tears she wouldn't let fall catching in the corners of her lashes. "We'll make them pay," she said finally, her tone sharp as broken glass. "Through the courts. Through the law. That's the only way this sticks. You go after them any other way, and they'll bury you." He studied her, the way she held herself like armor, the way every word carried the weight of conviction. "The law?" he asked quietly. "The same law that let them put me in cuffs while Ace bled out on the sand?" "That's exactly why," she snapped, stepping closer, jabbing a finger at his chest. "Because if you take this into your own hands, you'll be the one they put in prison, not them. They'll twist it until you're the villain. They already started, D. You know they did." His jaw worked, the memory of Doyle's smirk and Trent's trembling hands still alive in his mind. "They've already made me the villain. You heard them. They'll write whatever story they need to protect themselves." "Then we write a louder one," Amara shot back. "You think you're the only one who's ever been hurt by them? You're not. There are others. Witnesses, complaints, buried reports, I've spent my whole damn career going up against men like Doyle and Trent, and I've seen it over and over again. Corruption, cover-ups, intimidation. But if we can put it all together, if we can show the pattern, we can crack it wide open. They'll have no choice but to act. Her words were fierce, but Darius could see the tremor beneath them, the quiet plea hidden inside the battle cry. She wanted to believe the system could work because it was the only battlefield she knew. He respected that. He loved her for it. But he'd lived too long in places where rules were just paper waiting to be burned. He exhaled, long and steady, his voice softer now. Amara, I tried to follow the rules tonight. I stayed calm. I gave them respect. I showed them my ID. I did everything right. And Ace still died in my arms. His voice cracked then, just slightly, the first slip in the wall he had built around himself. So tell me, what's left for the law to fix? Amara's face crumpled for a second before she forced it back into steel. She grabbed his arm, her grip tight. You can't give up on this, D. Not like this. If you let them drag you into their game, they win. You have to let me fight this battle my way. He looked down at her hand on his arm, then back up into her eyes. For a moment he saw the girl she used to be, running barefoot through the red clay fields of Georgia, chasing after him with scraped knees and wide-eyed faith that her big brother could fix anything. That faith was still there, buried under years of law school and courtrooms, sharpened into something fierce and unrelenting. He placed his hand gently over hers. I'll let you fight your way, he said quietly, but don't ask me to stand still. She studied him, searching for cracks, for some promise that he wouldn't do what she feared. But Darius's eyes were cold, steady, and unreadable. Finally, she let go, stepping back, her voice quieter but no less firm. Then we'll do it together, you in your way, me in mine. But don't you dare go dark on me, D. If you go down, you'll drag me with you. You know that, right? He gave a slight nod. The night wind whipped between them, carrying the salt from the ocean, and the faint echo of Ace's last whimper still lodged in his memory. Amara turned, walking toward her car, her heels clicking sharp against the pavement. She stopped once, looking back at him. I'll be at my office first thing in the morning. I want every detail, every name, every second of what happened. If they think they can bury this, they're wrong. She opened the door, sliding inside, and started the engine. The headlights cut across him, carving his shadow long against the street. For a moment, brother and sister stared at each other through the windshield, both bound by blood, both ready for war, just not the same kind. Then she pulled away, the red glow of her taillights fading into the dark. Darius stood alone on the curb, the night pressing in on him. His body was still, but inside, something sharpened into steel. He respected her fight, but he knew her battlefield wasn't his. Theirs would run parallel, intersecting when it had to, but in the end, only one path would give him what he needed. He lifted his head, eyes narrowing against the dark horizon. Doyle and Trent thought tonight was the end of it, but for Darius Cole, it was only the beginning. The town looked different when you hunted in silence. Darius drove with the lights off for half the block before flicking them on again, sliding his truck into a space outside a shuttered barber shop on the east side. The neighborhood was quiet, a place that carried the weight of stories no one wanted to repeat. Boarded windows, rusted signs, the faint scrawl of graffiti fading under layers of neglect. He sat there a moment, watching, listening. His breathing was steady, but inside his chest something sharp pushed against his ribs. Purpose. He had made Amara promise to let her fight this through the courts, but that didn't mean he would wait idle. The law could gather its evidence, file its papers, argue its cases. His job was different. His job was to find the men Doyle and Trent had already broken and bring their stories back to light. The first was Marcus Red, a kid barely into his 20s when Doyle and Trent cornered him one night outside this very barber shop. Darius had read the thin report Amara dug up, a routine stop that ended with Marcus in the ER, ribs fractured, jaw wired shut. The case was dismissed before it even saw a courtroom. Marcus had vanished into silence after that. Now, 6 years later, he answered the door of a rundown apartment 3 blocks away. He was older but carried the same haunted look of someone who had once been young and fearless until it was beaten out of him. His left shoulder sloped unnaturally, an old injury that never healed right. Darius stood in the doorway, his presence filling the frame. Marcus read. The man hesitated, his eyes narrowing. Who's asking? My name's Cole. Darius Cole. I served. I know what they did to you. Doyle and Trent. The name alone made Marcus flinch, his jaw tightening, his hand gripping the door like it might keep the past out. You don't know a damn thing, he muttered, starting to close it. Before he could, Darius spoke again, softer this time. They killed my dog, right in front of me. Same lies, same abuse. I'm not here to pity you. I'm here because the world needs to hear what they did. You can stay silent, or you can help me put them where they belong. For a long moment, Marcus didn't move. Then, with a slow, tired sigh, he opened the door wider. Come in, he said. The apartment smelled of stale smoke and something fried days ago, but it was neat, organized in the way of a man who needed order to keep the chaos away. Marcus sat on the edge of the couch, rubbing the scar that trailed along his jaw. I filed complaints. I tried, but they made me out to be some thug looking for trouble. Said I resisted. They always say that. His voice cracked, the weight of memory pressing hard. They laughed while they broke my ribs, said no one would care. Darius leaned forward, his voice steady. But I care, and I'll make sure others do too. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a small recorder. Your words. Uncut, this time it won't disappear. Marcus stared at the device, then at Darius. There was hesitation, but beneath it flickered something else, a faint spark of defiance that hadn't been extinguished after all. He nodded slowly. All right, but if this goes bad, you never came here. Darius clicked the recorder on. The second name on his list was Loretta Johnson, 73, a widow who had lived in her house on the south side until Doyle and Trent pressured her to sell. The property ended up in the hands of a developer with friends in City Hall. Loretta had fought, but harassment visits from patrol cars and bogus citations drove her out. By the time Amara found her, she was living with her daughter in a cramped duplex across town. Darius found her porch lit by a dim bulb, the rocking chair creaking as she sat wrapped in a shawl. She squinted at him as he approached. You the lawyer's brother? Yes, ma'am, Darius said respectfully, lowering his head slightly. Amara's brother, Darius. She shook her head slowly. Those men, they came after me because I wouldn't sign, said I was holding up progress. Progress. Her laugh was bitter, hollow. Progress tore the roof off my life and left me with nothing. Darius knelt beside her chair, lowering his voice. Loretta, they'll keep doing it until someone stops them. I need your story. Will you let me tell it? Her eyes filled with tears, but her voice was firm. You tell it. You tell it loud. I want them to know I'm not afraid anymore. By the time Darius returned to his truck, it was past midnight. The recorder in his pocket held voices heavy with pain, but also something else. Truth, evidence, the kind of weight even the most corrupt system couldn't ignore forever. But he wasn't done. There was one more name that kept surfacing, whispered in the back rooms of bars and on the sidewalks after dark. A man named Henry Briggs, a former Marine who had crossed Doyle and Trent during a protest years ago. He'd been arrested, charged with assault, his career wrecked, his reputation gutted. He was the kind of man Darius wanted to find. Not just a victim, but a fighter. Someone who could still stand tall. It took him 2 more nights, but eventually he tracked Briggs to a rundown boxing gym on the outskirts of town. The smell of sweat and leather hit him as soon as he walked in. Heavy bags swung under the dim light, and in the far corner, a mountain of a man pounded away with fists like sledgehammers. When Darius approached, Briggs turned, sweat dripping down his face, eyes wary. You looking for a fight? No, Darius said. I'm looking for justice. Briggs studied him, then let out a humorless laugh. Justice? That word doesn't mean much anymore. It will, Darius said. Not if we fight alone, but if we fight together. Something in his tone made Briggs pause. He wiped his face with a towel, then nodded once. Tell me what you've got. By the time they sat in the small office at the back of the gym, the pieces had started to come together. Darius spoke little, only what mattered, laying out the pattern of abuse, the evidence he was gathering, the promise of exposure. Briggs listened, his face hardening with each detail. Finally, he leaned forward. You're serious about this? Darius met his eyes, unflinching. Dead serious. Briggs extended a calloused hand. Then count me in. Darius clasped it, feeling the weight of the man's grip. For the first time since Ace's body had gone still on the sand, He felt something other than rage. He felt momentum, a current pulling forward. He drove home that night with the city lights dim behind him, the ocean's dark expanse stretching endless to his right. He had the voices of the silenced, the stories buried under years of fear. Doyle and Trent thought they had erased their sins, but Darius knew better. Ghosts didn't stay buried forever. The house was quiet, so quiet it felt staged, and that was exactly how Darius wanted it. The living room smelled faintly of whiskey he hadn't touched, a half-empty bottle placed conspicuously on the coffee table next to an unlocked drawer where mail lay scattered like carelessness. The gun safe in the corner sat with its door slightly ajar, just enough to suggest negligence. Every detail had been arranged carefully, deliberately, the way he used to stage a room overseas when he wanted to flush someone out. He'd spent the last 2 nights setting up the cameras, tiny black eyes hidden in vents, behind a bookshelf, and inside the smoke detector. Each one pointed perfectly toward the spots he knew they'd use when they came for him. He sat in the dark, leaning back in a chair near the window, every muscle loose but his mind sharp, waiting. The street outside was quiet, only the occasional flick of headlights from passing cars. But then he heard it, the distinct rhythm of boots on pavement, the muted sound of men moving with intent. He didn't need to see to know. Doyle and Trent were coming. The knock on the door was sharp, commanding. "Cole, open up!" Doyle's voice carried that smug authority, the kind that had gotten him his way for years. Darius rose slowly, his footsteps measured. He unlocked the door and swung it open. The 2 men filled the doorway, Doyle with that grin he wore like a weapon, Trent with eyes twitching like a man on the edge. "Evening," Darius said evenly. "Mind if we come in?" Doyle asked, though it wasn't a question. "That depends," Darius said, leaning casually against the frame. "You got a warrant? Or you just here to shoot me like you shot my dog?" Trent smirked, pushing past him without waiting. "Funny guy." Doyle followed, clapping Darius hard on the shoulder as he passed, like he was doing him a favor by not knocking him down. "Relax, soldier. We just want to talk." Darius shut the door behind them, the click of the lock deliberate. He kept his posture slack, his breathing calm. He wanted them to feel in control. Trent circled the room, his eyes scanning the bottle, the mess, the ajar safe. He chuckled under his breath. "Look at this. Our boy here's slipping." "Guess war heroes don't keep it together forever," Doyle added, stepping closer until his face was inches from Darius's. "See, Cole, we've been thinking. The guy who jumped us, he wasn't some thug. He moved too clean, too precise, military, almost like Delta Force." He dragged the words out, watching for a reaction. Darius chuckled softly, shaking his head. "If I'd put hands on you, Doyle, you wouldn't have walked away." For the first time, Doyle's smirk flickered. It was there and gone in a second, covered with a sneer, but Darius saw it. He let the silence hang, let their own fear start gnawing at them. "Why don't you cut the bullshit?" Trent snapped. "You think you can make us look stupid? You think anybody's going to believe your word over ours?" "I don't need them to believe me," Darius said quietly. "I need them to see you." The tension in the air thickened. Doyle shifted his weight, squaring up, while Trent closed the space, his fists clenching. They wanted him to swing. They wanted him to give them the excuse they could write into a report later. So Darius gave them something else. He dropped his guard, letting the first punch land across his ribs. Pain flared white hot, but he didn't react. The second came fast, a hook that split his lip. He staggered back, coughing, spitting blood onto the floor. Trent grabbed him by the collar, shaking him. "Not so tough now, are you?" Trent sneered. Doyle joined in, shoving him against the wall. "You keep your mouth shut about us, Cole. You step out of line again, and we'll make sure you don't walk away next time." Darius let his body sag, every instinct screaming to fight back, to break their arms where they stood. But he held still, kept his breathing steady, endured. Every second was being caught on camera, every threat, every blow, every sneer. Trent shoved him one last time, knocking him to the floor. "Stay down, soldier." The 2 of them exchanged a look, the kind of unspoken agreement bullies shared when they thought they'd won. Doyle smirked again, wiping his hands like the job was done. "Come on, Trent. Let's leave him to his whiskey." They walked out, the door slamming behind them. For a long moment, Darius lay on the floor, his ribs throbbing, blood dripping from his lip. Then, slowly, He pushed himself up, every movement deliberate. He walked to his desk, pulled open the laptop, and tapped a key. The screen glowed to life, showing the crisp footage from the cameras. There they were, Doyle and Trent in his house, their fists flying, their threats clear, their arrogance on full display. Darius leaned back in the chair, wiping the blood from his chin with the back of his hand. His reflection stared back at him from the dark screen before the footage replayed. This was it, the first nail in their coffin. He could endure pain. He could endure humiliation. Because this was war, and wars weren't won with pride. They were won with strategy, with patience, with traps. He closed the laptop, the faint hum of the hard drive sealing away the evidence like a loaded weapon waiting for the right time. His ribs ached, his jaw throbbed, but his eyes were steady, cold. Doyle and Trent thought they'd walked away victors. They hadn't realized they'd just stepped into the sights of a man who never missed his target. The bruises were still fresh on his ribs, the dull ache pulsing each time he drew a breath. But Darius moved through the night with a calm precision that masked the pain. He had spent his entire life learning to disappear into shadows, to become the hunter when others thought he was prey. Tonight was no different. Tonight he would make Doyle and Trent feel the kind of fear they had fed to others for years. He started with Trent. The man had a pattern, predictable in the way only someone arrogant enough to feel untouchable could be. A few drinks at O'Malley's, the dingy bar on the corner of 7th, then a stumble out to the alley to piss against the wall before driving home drunk. Darius waited in that alley, pressed into the darkness, the hood of his jacket low over his face. The rain had come earlier, leaving the pavement slick, reflecting the dim yellow glow of the streetlight. When Trent staggered out, laughing to himself, his boots slapping wet against the ground, Darius stepped forward. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The shift of air, the sudden presence, made Trent spin, his words slurred. "Who's there?" Darius struck fast, one hand gripping the collar of Trent's jacket, the other pinning him against the wall. The impact knocked the drunken breath out of him, and the bottle he'd been carrying shattered at his feet. Trent's eyes widened as they adjusted to the face inches from his, calm, cold, relentless. "You remember, Ace?" Darius asked softly. Trent swallowed hard, his bravado dissolving under the weight of that voice. You're insane. You can't." Darius slammed him harder against the wall, cutting him off. "Ace didn't attack you. He obeyed me. He trusted me to protect him. And you put a bullet in him anyway." Trent's lip trembled, fear seeping through the alcohol. "You think this'll change anything? They'll bury you if you touch me." "I don't need to touch you," Darius said, leaning closer, his voice a whisper of steel. "I just need you to know I can. Anytime, any place, and when this all comes down, you'll be the first to fall." Trent tried to laugh, but it came out as a broken gasp. "You're bluffing." Darius reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded photo, Ace, standing tall by his side, eyes sharp, proud. He pressed it against Trent's chest. "That's who you killed, and every time you close your eyes, I want you to see him." He released him suddenly, and Trent crumpled to the ground, clutching the photo with shaking hands. Darius melted back into the shadows before Trent could even gather himself. By the time the officer stumbled to his feet, the alley was empty, but the fear lingered like smoke. Darius's next stop was Doyle. He knew Doyle wouldn't be drunk and sloppy. Doyle was the type who carried his arrogance like armor, who believed the badge on his chest was enough to shield him from anything. That made him dangerous, but also predictable. He always drove the same route home, always parked in the same spot behind his apartment building, always carried himself like a king walking into his castle. Darius was waiting on the fire escape. The rain had stopped, leaving the metal slick, but he crouched easily, his body steady, his breath even. When Doyle stepped out of his car, tossing his keys in his hand, Darius dropped down silently behind him. The sound of boots on wet pavement made Doyle turn, and his hand immediately went to his holster. But Darius was already there, a hand locking around Doyle's wrist, twisting just enough to make him drop the weapon without breaking it. The gun clattered against the ground, and Doyle's eyes widened, fury flashing across his face. "You think you scare me?" Doyle spat. Darius shoved him back against the wall, his forearm pressing into Doyle's chest. "You should be terrified." Doyle bared his teeth in a sneer, though Darius felt the rapid thump of his heartbeat beneath his arm. "You lay a hand on me, and I'll make sure they put you away forever." Darius leaned close, his voice low and calm, the way a man spoke when he was in complete control. "You already tried to bury me, but the ground doesn't hold me. And when the truth comes out, no badge, no smirk, no lies will save you." Doyle tried to shove him off, but Darius's grip was iron. He shifted just enough to bring his mouth near Doyle's ear. "This isn't about me anymore. It's about every man, every woman, every life you've crushed under your boots. You picked the wrong soldier, Doyle, and I don't miss my targets." He released him then, stepping back into the shadows. Doyle scrambled for his gun, whipping around, but the alley was empty. The only sound was his own ragged breathing, echoing loud in the silence. Later that night, Darius returned to his small house, his ribs aching, his lips still swollen. He sat at the desk, pulling up the footage from the cameras he had set. There it was, Doyle and Trent, their threats recorded in crystal clarity, every word, every blow preserved. And now, layered on top of that, the fear he had sown in the dark. He didn't need to kill them. He didn't need to break the law. All he needed was for the world to see them for what they truly were. He shut the laptop and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Ace's absence pressed heavy in the room. But tonight, for the first time since that gunshot shattered the world, Darius felt the shift. The tide was turning. Doyle and Trent thought they still had control, but their empire of fear had begun to crack. And when it broke, he would be there, not just as a grieving man, not just as a soldier, but as justice itself. The footage hit the airwaves on a Tuesday morning, first as a shaky clip leaked to a local reporter, then in full on the evening news. By nightfall, it was everywhere, on phones, on televisions, projected onto the walls of bars and churches and apartments where people gathered in stunned silence. The images spoke louder than any words. Doyle and Trent inside Darius Cole's home, fists slamming into his ribs, threats spilling from their mouths, arrogance etched across their faces as they struck a man who never once raised a hand against them. The story they had written in their reports unraveled frame by frame until nothing was left but the naked truth. By dawn, the station was surrounded. Protesters filled the sidewalks, voices rising in chants that shook the windows. Signs painted in bold letters bore Ace's name, bore the word justice scrawled in red and black. Mothers with strollers, veterans in worn jackets, teenagers with phones held high to record every moment. They all stood together, a tide that swelled larger with each passing hour. Inside his house, Darius watched the coverage, his jaw set, his body still sore from the bruises that hadn't yet faded. The voices from the crowd carried faintly through his open window, a chorus that mixed anger with hope. Amara paced the living room, her phone pressed to her ear as she barked instructions to a colleague at her firm. "File the injunction. No, do it now. The footage is airtight. Chain of custody is clear. They can't spin this anymore." She hung up and turned to Darius, her eyes fierce. "This is it. They can't bury it. You did it, D. You forced their hand." He shook his head slowly. "Not yet. This is only the first crack. They'll try to patch it. They'll smear me, smear everyone who stands with me. They'll double down before they break." And he was right. By the afternoon, Doyle and Trent were escorted into the courthouse through a back entrance, shields of officers surrounding them like kings under siege. Their faces were pale, their eyes darting, but Doyle still forced that smirk, still tried to wear the mask of a man in control. Cameras flashed like gunfire, reporters shouted questions, and though neither officer answered, the silence was deafening. At a press conference, the police chief read from a statement, his voice brittle. "The actions displayed in this footage do not reflect the values of this department. An internal investigation has begun. Officers Doyle and Trent have been placed on leave pending further review." The crowd outside erupted into fury. "Leave, not termination, not charges. Leave." Amara slammed her fist onto the counter when she heard it. "Leave? They think they can ride this out." "No, not this time." She grabbed her bag, shoving files inside. "I'm filing a civil suit today, and I want you there, D. I want them to see the man they tried to destroy standing tall in that courtroom." Darius studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I'll be there, but don't expect me to sit quietly if they try to twist this again." That night, the crowd outside the station swelled into thousands. Candles flickered in paper cups, Faces glowed with determination, and chants of justice for Ace rolled like thunder. Darius walked among them, not as a leader, not yet, but as a man the people gravitated toward. Some reached out to touch his arm, some whispered thanks, some simply stood close, as if his presence gave them strength. He carried himself with the same quiet steadiness that had carried him through war, but inside his chest something heavier stirred. This wasn't just his fight anymore, it belonged to all of them. Reporters cornered him near the courthouse steps the following morning. Microphones shoved toward his face, cameras buzzing. "Mr. Cole, do you plan to press charges personally? Do you see this as a racial issue? What do you want to say to Officers Doyle and Trent?" Darius looked into the sea of lenses and voices, and for once he spoke. His voice was calm but powerful, each word carrying the weight of truth. "I did everything right that night. I complied. I respected them. And they still shot my dog, still threw me in cuffs, still beat me inside my own home. This isn't about me being a soldier. This isn't about me being a black man. This is about power abused and justice denied. And I'll tell you this, I will not stop until justice is served." The clip spread faster than the footage had. His words cut through political spin, through the noise of pundits. Veterans groups issued statements of support. Civil rights organizations called for accountability. Even late-night talk shows played the video, their audiences gasping and applauding. But while the world outside rallied, inside the department, Doyle and Trent began to crack. Trent avoided the cameras, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. Doyle tried to hold the line, strutting into hearings with that same crooked smile, but Darius had seen it in the alley, the doubt in his eyes, the pulse of fear he couldn't hide. That fear was spreading now, gnawing at the edges of their arrogance. One evening, Amara returned home with a thin smile. "We got a trial date," she said, tossing the papers onto the table. "Sooner than I expected. Public pressure forced the judge's hand. This is happening, D. They're going to face a jury." Darius picked up the papers, reading the black letters that spelled out the beginning of the end. He set them down carefully, then walked to the window, looking out at the dark street. He could still see Ace there in his mind, tail wagging, ears alert, loyal until his last breath. He whispered softly, a promise carried only to himself. "We're almost there, boy." The storm had broken, and now there was no turning back. The courtroom was packed so tightly it felt like the walls themselves strained under the weight of expectation. Reporters lined the aisles, microphones poised, notebooks balanced on their knees, while townsfolk pressed shoulder to shoulder in the gallery, some clutching candles from the vigils that had burned outside for weeks. The hum of whispered voices faded the moment the judge entered, gavel striking with a sound that cut through every heart in the room. All eyes turned to the two men at the defense table, Doyle and Trent, once smug and untouchable, now pale, their uniforms traded for stiff suits that looked borrowed, ill-fitting, like masks that no longer held. Darius sat across the aisle, his broad frame contained in a dark suit that carried none of the pretense of theirs. His presence was quiet, steady, his expression carved from stone, but his eyes betrayed the storm within. Amara sat beside him, a stack of files at her elbow, her hand resting lightly over his for a brief moment before she rose to deliver her opening. She spoke with fire in her voice, not the wild, uncontrolled kind, but the sharp flame of a lawyer who had turned grief into weapon. She laid out the story piece by piece: Ace, the stop on the sand, the bullet, the beating inside Darius's home, the videos, the voices of victims who had been silenced for years. Each word struck like a hammer, forging a chain that bound Doyle and Trent tighter than any handcuffs ever had. The defense tried their part, fumbling with claims of fear, of threat, of split-second decisions. But with every argument, the footage played on screens around the courtroom, the audio echoing with their own voices, their threats, their laughter as fists connected. The jury watched, stone-faced, while murmurs rippled through the gallery. Then came the testimonies. Marcus Red took the stand first, his voice trembling but strong as he described the night his ribs cracked under their boots. Loretta Johnson followed, her shawl draped over her frail shoulders, eyes burning with a dignity no eviction could erase as she told how they hounded her out of her home. And finally Henry Briggs, his massive hands folded tight, his voice carrying the weight of a Marine's honor. spoke of how they stripped him of everything he had built. By the time he stepped down, Doyle and Trent were no longer just officers accused of a single crime. They were exposed as predators, patterns of cruelty stretching back years. When the judge called for a recess, the crowd spilled into the courthouse steps, a tide of voices rising in chants, signs waving above the sea of heads. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but Darius said nothing. He stood at the top of the steps, his gaze sweeping the horizon, the chant of justice for Ace rolling like thunder beneath him. For the first time since that night on the sand, he felt Ace beside him, not in body, but in spirit, a steady presence anchoring him as he faced the storm. The verdict came on the third day. The jury filed in, their faces grave, their decision heavy in their hands. The foreman rose, voice steady, and spoke the word that had hung in the air since the trial began: guilty, on every count. The sentence followed swiftly, 25 years, no parole. The gallery erupted, cheers and sobs mingling as the judge pounded his gavel for order. Doyle sat frozen, his smirk gone forever, while Trent dropped his head into his hands, his shoulders shaking. Amara squeezed Darius's arm, whispering fiercely, "We did it." But Darius didn't smile. He stood slowly, his eyes fixed on the two men being led away in chains. For all the victory, for all the cheers, a hollow place inside him ached still, because no verdict could bring back what he had lost. That night, when the courthouse emptied and the candles outside burned low, Darius drove to the small cemetery by the coast. The waves crashed softly in the distance, the salt wind cool against his face. He walked slowly to the simple marker he had placed weeks earlier, the earth still fresh, the name etched clear: Ace. He knelt, laying a small wooden box on the ground before opening it. Inside was his Delta Force medal, the one he had carried through war, the one that had survived when so many men hadn't. He took it in his hand, feeling the weight, the history, the blood behind it. Then he set it gently against the marker. "You never left my side," he said softly, his voice breaking, carried away by the sea breeze. "You stayed with me to the end. This is yours now. Justice is yours." His hand lingered on the cool stone, his head bowed. For a moment the soldier, the hunter, the commander was gone. All that remained was a man mourning his friend. He stayed there until the sky began to lighten, until the first rays of dawn cut across the water. When he finally rose, he felt something shift inside him, not peace exactly, but a sense of closure, a knowledge that the fight had meant something more than revenge. Ace had not died in silence. His name had become a rallying cry, his story a spark that lit the fire of change. As Darius walked back to his truck, he glanced once more at the horizon, the sun spilling gold across the waves. For the first time in a long time, he let himself breathe deeply, filling his lungs with the salt air. He carried no illusions. There would always be another battle, another injustice waiting. But for now, for this moment, he had kept his promise. Ace was gone, but Ace was immortal.